All right. Well, first, what prompted your decision to run?
Well, it's a number of things. So first and foremost, I think that we're at a unique opportunity as a city to really move in the right direction, but it requires new leadership. The issues that we face are urgent, and I think that the ideas that are going to move us forward have to come from people who are thinking outside of the box in terms of what the city needs, and are not afraid of challenging a system that we know in many ways does not serve the best interests of the public. So for me, it comes out of that sense of responsibility. I live in the community. I live in Garfield Park, so I see the issues when I walk out of my house every day. And so it's that sense of responsibility and the sense of urgency, but the need for new leadership also.
You said you feel the city needs ideas that are outside of the box. What do you see as some of your ideas that would be outside the box?
Well, when we talk about education, for example, we're talking about radically reimagining education and schooling. We talk about the need for an elected school board. We talk about what it looks like to have the arts and vocational education in schools, what it looks like to have an education that's not premised on over-testing children. What does it look like to have an administration that is actually focused on what's in the best interest of children? What does a school system look like that's actually in the hands of educators and not corporate CEOs? Economically, what we talk about new forms of revenue. We talk about a public bank, which is a revolutionary idea when it comes to a city's finances. We talk about worker-owned cooperatives as the viable kinds of economic job creators and business creators that we need. No one else is talking about these things. We're pushing a financial transaction tax because we believe that this is the time and the environment to make sure that all of our corporations, our financial sector, that everyone is sharing the burden of making sure that the city is healthy and grows. And no one else is talking about these kinds of ideas, and that's something that has made us, that has distinguished us from other candidates in this race.
You have a great deal of experience working in the public policy arena as a consultant, and you worked with Mayor Daley's administration, but you haven't held public office yet. So what on your resume do you think best qualifies you to be mayor?
I think it's everything on my resume. I think it is the diversity of experience and the type of experience. Someone who has worked both at the top level of city government, which I have, who worked across policy areas. So I was doing everything from food security to education to housing to violence prevention, having that breadth of experience, but also someone who has that grassroots experience. I've worked with, as the executive director of a couple of nonprofits, I've worked with grassroots community-based organizations and have served oftentimes as that bridge between the top level policymakers and those of us who are on the ground doing the work so that we can make sure that those policies actually are relevant to us. And not many elected officials can say that they have both of those vantage points. I've also worked in the private sector. I've worked with mayors and city managers of other municipalities on policy issues. I've worked in academia. So I think it's about looking at the breadth and the quality of experience. And someone who has that diversity of experience. It's not just about an ability to fundraise, right? I don't think that qualifies you to be able to speak to what are the issues that average Chicagoans face? What are the issues that the majority of Chicagoans face? People are looking for leadership that understands them and that can empathize with their challenges and with their needs and their desires.
Just to move to some specific policy issues, an important one for the city will be the fiscal challenges that come in the years ahead. Now, were you to win, you'd be contending with what is possibly one of the city's greatest financial challenges when the mandated contributions to the firefighters and police funds jump and potentially increasing the city's deficits significantly. What steps does the mayor need to take in order to protect the city's balance sheet?
Well, the first thing that the mayor would need to do is to be honest and forthright about what that balance sheet looks like. In addition to bringing these new ideas to the table, financial transaction tax, public bank, and other revenue-generating proposals, we have to be honest about what our city's finances are. For example, no one is talking about the fact that because we have had these horrible policies, not just under this administration, but under the previous administration before that, we are in a position where a property tax increase is almost inevitable. And so what I have committed to, and this campaign is committed to, is to be honest with the people of Chicago. We're not going to say that we're going to make the hard decisions, but then kick the can down the road, which is what the current mayor has done. We want to come out and say, because of the failed policies of the past, we are in a very difficult situation, and here's what we need to do to make sure that we can move forward. One of those things is unfortunately, a property tax increase. The other is looking at what happened with CPS and the misleading maneuverings that CPS has done to present a false picture of what their finances look like. And right now, the solutions are so thin because instead of working on those solutions, the mayor and the current administration has been doing so much to present a different picture, which is completely dishonest. So I think we all know that there are going to be difficult decisions that have to be made fiscally. And I think the best way to handle it is, number one, to bring these new ideas that we're talking about to the city of Chicago about how to grow the economy. Work-owned cooperatives, a public bank, a financial transaction tax, workforce development investments, but also to be very honest about what the state of our fiscal health is in this city. And that means being forthright about what taxes are needed to be increased immediately because we did not address these issues over the last 4 years or in the previous years before that.
Can you speak a little bit about your idea for a public bank?
So right now we are in debt to other financial entities. I think at last check was about $900 million. So the concept of a public bank is the notion of a bank as a public utility. So a bank that actually works for the interests of the city of Chicago. Its allegiance is to the taxpayers. And so what that means is we have the money to actually invest our own dollars into extending lines of credit, for example, to small businesses, to extending for homeowners who want to get loans for homes and repairs on their buildings if you're a landlord. These are the sorts of things that it's very difficult to get private financing from traditional banking institutions. The other is infrastructure, having the money to execute these infrastructure projects, our streets, our sewage systems, all of those sorts of projects at low interest rates. Right now, the interest rates are sky high, and with that interest, the city never sees any of those dollars. We're just paying it out to these other financial entities. So imagine if that interest is actually recirculating back into our economy. It reduces the cost of these projects, but it also means that our money is recirculating back, which is in the interest of the public, the taxpayers. So it's something that has worked. North Dakota, they found that the Bank of North Dakota is actually outperforming all of the Wall Street banks. It is something that has been done in Europe, so it exists and the model is there. It's just a matter of pushing this idea for the city of Chicago.
As the city contends with the financial issues, and if you were to be mayor, do you think that service cuts would be on the table?
Well, we have to. So the way that we handle this, because what the current administration has done is they, for example, closed 50 schools, they closed 6 mental health clinics, and they tell us that it's to save money. And then we find out that, in fact, no money was saved. So with the school closings, we actually spent more on maintaining the buildings and consultants. And so there's this false narrative that's being presented that makes it seem as though we have to do these service cuts, but we're not getting anything in return. And so the way that we present what needs to happen is we have to present, here are the services that the city offers. Most important, public safety, infrastructure, our education system. These are the things that taxpayers believe that their tax dollars are going to pay for. Now we have to show them what is our fiscal health. What does it look like? What does that landscape look like? And we put it to the taxpayers to say, in light of where we are financially, what things should we cut, right? What you'll find is that most people do not want their public safety budgets cut. They do not want money for schools cut. They don't want a lot of these things cut. And so then the question becomes, how do we identify new sources of revenue to make sure that we don't have to cut those vital services? And this is where talking about a property tax increase is much more amenable, because you're thinking about, is it the quality of my schools, or is it a higher property tax, or a financial transaction tax? Do we finally make sure that the financial sector is actually paying into the economy like everyone else? So now these ideas begin to gain traction. Or we talk about other options, for example, a tax on services, which Illinois is one of the few states in the country that doesn't tax services. So this is a substantial form of revenue that we could use to be able to plug some of the budget shortfall. So I think it's less about saying, here's what we have to cut, because this is what the governor-elect is doing, this is what the current administration has done, and it's more about saying, here are the vital services that we know are important to you. Here's where we are financially. Here are the areas where we can possibly cut, but here are the opportunities for revenue that can make sure that this doesn't become something that is so painful for the taxpayers of this city.
You speak of the inevitability of a property tax cut, and as I'm sure you know, that's something that gives many tax increase. I'm sorry, as you know, that's something that gives many Chicagoans great anxiety. Have you thought about the scope of an increase that might be necessary?
Well, we've been doing this analysis for months now. We have an excellent team of economists, people who analyze taxes both at the city level and the state level. And so the question is, what does that increase look like? And of course, we want to make sure that it's as I can't say painless, but there's as little pain as possible while understanding the reality of what needs to happen. And we know that it's not politically popular, and this is part of the reason why for years, under every administration, they've said, oh, we didn't raise property taxes. Even with this 2015 budget, we analyzed all of that entire budget from start to finish. And while the mayor and many of the aldermen were saying, well, we didn't raise property taxes. Well, if you looked at all of the taxes that were increased, it essentially amounted to what a property tax increase would have looked like anyway. And so again, it's that kind of dishonest political maneuvering that I think actually does a disservice to the public, because they need to know that we're honest with them about what our financial status is. And they need to know that, look, these are hard decisions, but we can do it together, and we can do it in an honest and forthright way. And I think that kind of language, I think, is refreshing to a city that has heard so much of, well, we didn't increase property taxes, but everything else in my life, everything else has increased. So it's like, what's the difference?
Mayor Emanuel has faced much criticism that his policies have exacerbated income inequality in the city, widening the gap between rich and poor and diminishing the strength of the middle class. What are your thoughts on income inequality, and how would you seek to diminish it as mayor?
Chicago is one of the top cities in terms of the gap between those who are the highest earners and those at the bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum. And that has done nothing but hurt this city. So we already know that we've lost almost 200,000 residents over 10 years. Many of those residents were from the south and west side of the city, and they ended up moving out, largely because they could not find work, their homes were foreclosed upon, communities that are not safe. This is all a product of disinvestment in areas of the city for decades. And so the way that we combat that is with investment, and it is in creating a growth economy. So right now we have a scarcity economy where we're told this has to be cut because we don't have enough money. And so the easy answer is always to say we don't have money. We have to flip that paradigm to start thinking about, what does a growth economy look like? And so a lot of the ideas that we're putting forth are about, how do we grow the economy so that people are earning more money naturally. And so our most recent proposal on worker owned cooperatives, we found that, for example, in New York, which has one of the largest cooperatives in the country, earners, the employees, earn from $10 to $25 an hour over just a few years. That was their wage. We also find they have more benefits. So they're not relying on, they're not having health insurance, for example. These are the things that affect quality of life. So what we're seeing now in the city is there's so much debate around the minimum wage increase, but we're not talking about the cost of living increases in the city, and why when the cost of tickets increases, how that disproportionately hurts low-income and middle-income residents. We're not talking about how when we privatize our public transportation, how that disproportionately affects those residents that rely on public transportation to get to work because they don't have a car, and maybe they don't want to have a car. These are the things that we're not talking about, but it's contributing to that increase in income inequality and the quality of life between those who are wealthier and those who don't have as much. But that's something that as a city we can address, but we're just not doing it because we don't have leadership that sees it from that standpoint. We have leadership that is more concerned with those who are politically connected and perhaps have the finances to have political clout and influence in decision making. I think that hurts our city.
What can the mayor do to stimulate job growth in the city?
Well, one of the biggest things that we have to do is we have to invest in workforce development. We have to recognize what are our strengths as an economy. And so many of our key sectors, manufacturing, IT, and healthcare, if we're not developing a pipeline into those sectors, then we don't have a big tool that can actually attract not only companies to locate here, but creation of jobs here. one of the biggest planks of our platform is about small businesses and making sure that entrepreneurs have a clear path to business ownership, because we know that that strengthens the economy, especially in the neighborhoods. And we know that small businesses actually tend to hire locally more often than the large corporations that the mayor is proud to say we've attracted to downtown. And so a public bank, for example, helps facilitate the growth of small businesses. Expanding work-owned cooperatives means more people are owners of businesses. They're making more money. They're hiring from the community. Those are the things that create jobs. And then when we have a labor force that is adequately trained with the skills in manufacturing, in construction, in IT, in healthcare, then companies are looking to locate here because they want to hire, because our labor force is so high quality. And that's what makes Chicago an attractive place. Those are the things that create jobs. It's not just poaching headquarters from the suburbs and claiming that we've created jobs. Who gets those jobs? Is it residents that get those jobs? Many times it's not. So we have to have real job creation.
Just as income disparities take a toll on Chicago, so do racial ones. Many Chicagoans of color face over-policing and have difficulty accessing the same resources, such as schools and public transportation, which are readily available to their fellow residents in other neighborhoods. What disparities that often fall along race lines do you see as being most significant, and what would you do to address them?
Well, the disparities that fall along race lines also fall along socioeconomic lines. And we're seeing that so much in Chicago. We talked about for policing, and this has been a huge issue nationally. And one of the studies one of the lines of data that always sticks out to me is the number of stops or the number of cases that were filed, complaints that were filed against the police. It was over 10,000 cases. And the number that had actually been carried forward was about 274. And so you know that there's a huge disparity when people are having these negative experiences with the police. Who's listening, and is there any justice from their end? Are their complaints taken seriously? We know that the likelihood of being stopped if you're an African American is 10 times the rate if you're a white resident or white individual. So we know that there are disparities in policing. The question is, what are we going to do about it, and do we have the courage to actually address this issue head on? What I found is that because it can be a potentially contentious issue, many will shy away from it, or they'll just ignore it, and maybe after the election they'll start to say something about it. But if we're serious about addressing these disparities, especially when it comes to race and class, we have to tackle them head on, and we cannot be afraid to talk about police brutality, to talk about even the disparities in who's getting jobs, to talk about why one community has not seen any kind of significant investment for the last 40 years, but we have so much investment that's going into the central business district. We have to be willing to talk about it. But the other thing is that this is about our collective interest, and that addressing issues of race does not mean that you are racist or that you are divisive. It means that we acknowledge the issues in our city, and we recognize that we have a collective interest in doing better, in making sure that we're reducing inequity wherever it exists. And I think it takes a certain level of maturity and a desire to really see the city grow together to really address those issues in a way that recognizes our diversity of experiences, that recognizes the real pain that people experience because of racism, because of classism, because of sexism, because of discrimination based on their sexual orientation. You have to recognize that their experiences are real. And if we recognize that, then we have to, in good faith, do everything possible to address their needs and to make sure that they're heard and that it's reflected in the policies that we put forth.
How safe a city do you perceive Chicago to be?
Depends on where you are. And I don't like that fact. Mm-hmm. I think that an equitable city is a city where you can be in any neighborhood and feel fine. And right now that's not the case. I think that under this current administration and previous administrations, we have been okay with violence and crime as long as it's in those areas, as long as it's in that community, as long as it's in those projects when we had the public housing. And it should be unacceptable anywhere. I think what we've seen is that now that we've seen more reports of crime and violence in areas where we don't typically associate them with crime and violence, so if it's in Lincoln Park or if it's in Irving Park, then all of a sudden it becomes this big thing. But it should be unacceptable across the board. I want people, the young people that I work with in some of these communities, when they go, I just remember an experience where we were taking them downtown. It was like a service learning kind of project. And one of the girls remarked that we were walking down the street, and how she was just walking down the street and how she just felt so free. And so she wasn't looking over her shoulder. This is what she was saying to me. She didn't feel like she had to look over her shoulder. And to me, that said so much, because she deserves to be able to walk on her block and feel just as free as she felt when she was walking in the block when we were on Columbus downtown. And that's the kind of Chicago that I want. I want people to feel as safe regardless of where they are.
What were your thoughts on President Obama's speech on immigration a few weeks back?
Well, as the daughter of immigrants, this is a huge issue for me. I know what it's like, both from family and people that I've been close to who have come to this country and who struggle. So I was pleased. I was very pleased, because I think it's a start. Of course, I would love to have many more things included, but I understand how contentious this issue was and why it wasn't even done in the first term. But I think that we have to start somewhere. And I think that his speech and the policies gave people a lot of hope who had been in the darkness or who felt that they didn't have any options. And so I think it's a good first step.
I wanted to ask a little bit follow-up on that. Can you tell us a little bit about your parents and the background and how that also plays into your understanding of Chicago and the international scene?
Yes, so my parents are immigrants from Nigeria, and they're also activists. So my work is sort of the legacy of their work. And so my father fought in our civil war. We had a civil war in Nigeria in 1967, and he was 21 at the time when he engaged in that war. And at the time, the genocide was taking place against our ethnic group, the Igbo people. So they were being slaughtered, essentially. And so he got into that war against the Nigerian government. And my mother was a frontline nurse in that war. And I always tell the story that later on, years and years later, when I asked my dad why he would decide at 21, which is the prime of life I think it was the prime of life for a young man, why would you fight in a war against a country, especially when he wasn't sure that we were going to win? And he said it's not the fact that it was necessarily our people being killed, it's the fact that he just can't stand oppression. And so they fought for years on a war that was supposed to be over within days, and they didn't win. And after the war was over, we had a number of dictators in Nigeria, and my parents continued fighting against those dictators. And it was dangerous work. They eventually came to the United States and began organizing here in Chicago on the north side, organizing the Nigerian community, the African community against those dictators. And it was to the point where in 1997, 7 individuals were executed by the government. And I also found out later from my parents that the Nigerian government had been sending emissaries to our home in the Chicago area to intimidate them because of their work against the government. And so it was dangerous work. At the time, I remember going to the press conferences. I remember typing up for my dad. He wrote the blueprint for Nigeria's democracy, and I remember typing up that document when I was younger. But I also remember their determination and the sense that they had that a government is supposed to work on behalf of the people, and that if it is not, we have a responsibility to push back against that government and to push for a system that actually works, because they lived that experience. And so we grew up with that experience. And so everything that we're doing in Chicago and that I'm doing in Chicago is driven by that same sense of this is what government is supposed to be, and this is the responsibility that we have as citizens to hold our government accountable and to push back against that system, and we can't be afraid to do so. My parents did it in a context where many people disappeared, people were killed, people were thrown in jail. They had that experience, but they still pressed forward. And so when we look at Chicago and what's happening with our current mayor and this sense of invincibility about him, or the sense that because I'm not wealthy or I'm not the right race or the right gender, that I somehow cannot possibly challenge this mayor, I think about my parents' experience. And I think about the issues that we face in Chicago that are actually global issues. They're playing out in countries all around the world. And this is why it's so important what we do in this election, because it's going to send a message worldwide about how people engage with their government and how they push for systems change.
Shifting gears a little bit, so we're focused on some questions having to do with the LGBT community. Just first, on a general level, what work have you done with the LGBT community in Chicago, and how do you plan on reaching out to them in the future during the campaign?
Well, the work that I've done so far extends back to my community work, when just working with community-based organizations. This has been, I think, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. There's some that are unique to the LGBTQ community, but there are some that I think are overlooked in that community. And so one of the biggest things that I was doing long before even running for mayor is looking at economic disparity. And I had a couple of colleagues that were in that community who we would talk about those issues because there were some perceptions, for example, that if you're in the LGBTQ community, you're wealthy, that you don't have any economic challenges, that everything is just great. And so I spent a lot of time doing research that found that, in fact, many individuals within that community are caretakers and have children and are at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And that it's actually not the case that everyone's just wealthy and fine economically. And I think these facts need to be pulled out because we don't hear that dialogue happening as much. I think there's a misperception about the LGBTQ community in many senses in the work that we do, just this community-based work. We also found, I used to do some work in public health and just analyzing the disparities in the community in terms of access to public health services, making sure that people have adequate access in that community. And then there's this issue of just amplifying the issues in communities that are not necessarily as tied to the core of the LGBTQ community's work. And so, for example, on the west side of Chicago, where one of the stories that really resonated with me, because I felt that it was a story that really needed to be told, it was a 2-part article on transgender women who were killed on the west side of Chicago. And what happened with the investigation, with how they were treated by the police during the investigation, with how their families were treated during the course of the investigation. And I thought it was so crucial because we don't often, at least in the community work that I did, we don't often talk about those kinds of stories. We hear about the usual, the shootings and that sort of thing. But having a closer analysis on the plight of transgender women who are right here in our community, whose stories are not being told, I thought was powerful because it exposes people to someone outside of themselves that they should also be concerned about, because we're in this, in my opinion, together. So what affects a transgender woman is just as important to me as what affects a heterosexual man or woman, right? And so I think that work being much more incorporated into just the overall advocacy work is important, because we all have to advocate for each other. And even within the community, within the LGBTQ community, making sure that we're advocating for each other, that no one is left out, that that we don't leave anyone behind. I think that's what I want to convey, that we don't leave anyone behind, that we recognize our connectedness and why it's so important that we advocate for each other and recognize the struggles that we have, even if they're unique, but they're part of a bigger struggle. And that's something that I've always tried to do, working in the community, working at the ground level.
Maybe if you could speak a little bit more about interactions that you've had with the transgender community.
Well, one of my favorite people, she works with an organization that helps transgender individuals get access to services. And so we have been talking just actually for a couple of years now. And one of the things that I had the privilege of being able to do was participate in a panel. This is about, is it a year ago? Where it was a coalition of all of these different organizations that I think it was the Chicago Black Gay Men's Caucus, it was Affinity, it was several other organizations. And she and I got to participate on a panel together just talking about some of the economic issues in the community. And I was able to bring the perspective of someone who just does community work. And of course she had the expertise of actually working directly with the transgender community. And I thought it was a very good fit because we kind of were able to play off of each other. So it's just that work. And then actually on the ground level, being able to be a voice with other community-based organizations who don't generally focus on the transgender community and sort of exposing them to why this is important and I guess acclimating them to that and being able to make connections to organizations that do that work. So for example, Affinity does so much work already in that area and being able to bring people together. And I think being able to make those connections is something that I can do as someone who is perhaps not as deeply entrenched, but being able to plug people into those resources, I think, has been helpful.
You know, I would also add on that area, what have you, in your community-based work, your interaction on the issue of HIV and AIDS, especially in communities that are disproportionately affected, including trans women and African-American gay men, or men who have sex with men?
Well, so the most recent is on Monday. So I worked with, it's an organization called Monday Night Mingle. And what they do is they try to expose people to the importance of getting tested in an environment that's not clinical. And this is important because a lot of people, particularly in the African American community, for example, it's getting them to go to a clinic and say, okay, I'm going to get an HIV test. It can be daunting. And so the goal is to create these safe, relaxed spaces where people can come together. There's food, there's music, we have hosts, they play trivia games, and make it very fun and a very relaxed environment where people feel comfortable getting the test. So we actually have the tests on site, and it's just the swab test. So it's very, very simple, very undaunting, and we find that that's been very effective. And so it's just because we know that we have to reach people where they are, and within the Black community, that's always been a challenge, getting people to feel comfortable getting tested. And I think some of that translates over into other communities as well. And so that's what we try to do. And then on Monday for World AIDS Day, we did a kind of a symbolic ceremony in the morning where we released balloons in honor of those who we knew who had died from AIDS, but also to raise awareness about the importance of really getting serious about making sure that we know the facts, that we get tested regularly, and that we tell other people. Because I think it's also about not just doing it for me, but telling other people in our circle so that they can get tested as well.
Homelessness is a serious issue in the city, of course, and a disproportionate number of homeless youth are LGBT. What do you see as some work that can be done on that?
Well, definitely access to centers where they are welcome. I think one of the big challenges is even if you're homeless and you go to a center that doesn't feel welcoming or that you feel would be judgmental or you don't feel safe, I think that's an issue because what's the point of having a center if you don't feel comfortable going to that center? The people who are supposed to be reached don't feel welcome in that center. So I think creating safe spaces, more safe spaces around the city, even in areas that we don't traditionally associate with the LGBTQ community. So we know that, yes, there's access to some spaces, for example, on the north side. But what about spaces on the west side? What about spaces on the south side where individuals are really dealing with homelessness and they have nowhere else to go? In communities where if you are transgender, if you are lesbian, if you are gay, there are few safe spaces. So how do we create those spaces for them? And I think we have to be more intentional about that and recognize that we, again, have to meet people where they are. And with homeless, especially the young people, many of whom maybe they were kicked out of their homes, maybe they were staying with friends, they're all probably struggling economically, right, obviously. How do we create a safe space that's accessible to them where they can feel welcome? We have to be intentional about it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, for that whole issue of homelessness in general, though, we're talking about lack of affordable housing across the city for students, for young people, for veterans, et cetera. So what's your kind of take on, since you're especially your urban planning background, the need for affordable housing and how the city can get engaged in that?
Well, it's absolutely critical. I mean, we lost 200,000 residents over 10 years. We also found that CHA had been sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars that's allocated specifically for affordable housing in this city. We know that we have a waiting list that is running into the tens of thousands, and that there was no explanation as to why those dollars were not used to create more affordable housing, which is what it was supposed to be used for. That is completely unacceptable. We actually have to demand the kind of transparency and openness with funding that the city already has. So it wasn't the thing that we could say, oh, we don't have the money. We had the money, but we did not use it for why it was supposed to be used. And I think that's a problem. So one is transparency and holding the city accountable to use the funding for affordable housing. The other is in how the paradigm of development. And so right now we have developer-driven development, which means that a developer will come in, they'll say what they want, they'll make whatever deal with the alderman, and then they'll notify the community about what's already been decided upon. What we need to have is community-driven development, where the community actually has a voice in determining what that development looks like to make sure that it actually works for the community. And affordable housing almost always comes up. So we see this happening in Logan Square, we see it in Uptown, where communities are losing access to housing, but because they don't have leadership that is advocating for affordable housing, nothing is being done about it. And this is why the populations are changing in Uptown, in Logan Square, even in South Shore, because we don't have that paradigm that prioritizes the community's needs and affordable housing to make sure that people who live there can stay there. This is tied to gentrification. If we're not intentional about saying that we are responsible for making sure that as these developments are occurring, we are preserving affordable housing, we're going to see our communities change, and people who've lived there sometimes for decades are getting pushed out of their neighborhoods. But we have to be intentional about it, and we have to take the lead on that.
Mayor Emanuel is going to be well financed in the election. His war chest is about nine or 10 million right now. How are you going to be getting the word out about your candidacy over the next few months?
We do it the old-fashioned way. We get out, we hit the streets, we talk to people. We've been on this unity tour now for almost the last year, which is just going into every different neighborhood, talking to big groups, small groups, in living rooms and coffee shops, spreading our message of what our vision is for Chicago. Because it's not enough to be against something. We have to tell people what it is that we are for. And so it's resonated with people, and then they tell their people, and then their people tell their people. And that's how we've been able to get so much support now, because of just doing the on-the-ground work of knocking on doors, getting out into the neighborhoods, being accessible and open. And because people, when they hear the message, they're very enthusiastic about it. And that's one thing that no amount of money can buy is passion. And the people that have gotten involved with this campaign and that are spreading the message feel very passionate about it. And so they're so committed. And so they've been doing so much work on behalf of the campaign to spread the message. And I think that's how we've been able to get as far as we have.
I'm curious, oftentimes I've seen you listed as other in the media. What is your media strategy? Because that's half the battle is free earned media out there.
Yeah, well, so we knew going in that the media was not going to be our best friend. So we sort of knew that going in. We try to be aggressive with the media. So everything that we send out, we make sure we send to the media. And then, unfortunately, it's up to them as to whether or not they'll follow up, whether they'll write anything about it. But what we're finding is that other people are talking about us, and as more people talk about us, then the media has to pay attention. Mm-hmm. The other thing that is a defining moment is getting on the ballot. And so last week, I finally officially submitted my petitions to get on the ballot. And I think that changes the game, because once you're on the ballot, the media does have an obligation to actually cover all of the candidates. And so that takes away some of the convenience of really not paying attention or putting us in the box as other. So I think the dynamic will change as we move forward.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have anything final you want to say in particular to the LGBT community about what you would do as mayor of Chicago to make this city more unified and egalitarian?
I think the key word is unity. We, for the last 4 years, and maybe the last 22 years before that, have lived under a system, I think, that divides us based on our race, based on our gender, based on our class, a system that makes people feel that the differences are bigger than the things that bring us together. And so my message is that the things that we have in common are so much greater than the perceived differences amongst us. And that only when we unify can we really change this system. But we have to believe that it's possible. I think that everyone can find that they're connected in some way. And so even if I live in Edgewater, I care about what happens in Inglewood because my children will ride the bus with someone from Inglewood. If I go to a school in Roseland, I care about what's happening in Hegewisch because I'm going to go to a grocery store with someone who lives in Hegewisch. That violence affects me wherever I live in the city. That even if I'm not lesbian, those are my issues because I know what it feels like to be discriminated against. If I'm not transgender, I know what it feels like to have my voice silenced, even as a candidate, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are all of these things that, these experiences that I think we can all draw upon to show that the things that we have in common are so much greater. And if we unify, we actually can change the system, but we have to believe it. And I believe it. And I think now as we spread our message, more and more people are believing it. And I think that belief is what's going to change the course of the city's history in the upcoming election.